What did she do to him? Edward Whitmore's voice barely rose above a whisper, yet it echoed through the hallway like something fragile had just cracked open inside him as he stood motionless outside the half-open bedroom door, fingers still resting against the cool brass handle, breath shallow, unsure whether to step in or stay exactly where he was, because for the first time in nearly 8 months, the sound on the other side wasn't chaos, wasn't the sharp, relentless rhythm of panic that used to fill every inch of this house after sunset. It was silence, real silence, the kind that felt alive, the kind that made the air warmer somehow, softer, as if the walls themselves had finally exhaled, and through the narrow gap, he could see it, Lucas, his son, lying still beneath the dim amber glow of a bedside lamp, small chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm that didn't belong to nightmares or exhaustion but to actual rest, deep and unbroken. The kind no doctor, no specialist, no carefully scheduled routine had ever been able to give him, and Edward's jaw tightened as he stared, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he thought he understood, because just hours ago, this same room had felt like a storm trapped inside four walls, the air sharp with tension, the floor scattered with the quiet evidence of another failed night, and he had stood there then too, in this exact spot, convinced that control was the only answer, that distance was protection, that no outsider, especially not someone like her, could possibly reach a place he himself had failed to touch, and yet now, as the soft hum of the night filled the space where fear used to live, something shifted in his chest, subtle but undeniable, like a truth he had avoided was finally forcing its way through, because he remembered the moment, her presence barely noticeable at first, the way she hadn't rushed forward or spoken over the noise, hadn't tried to fix anything the way everyone else had, but instead had simply stayed, quiet, steady, like she understood something he didn't even know how to name, and he had dismissed her, with the same cold certainty he applied to everything in his world, reducing her to a role, a title, a line on a payroll that could be erased without consequence, and now here he was, standing in the doorway of something he couldn't control, couldn't explain, watching his son finally at peace, and realizing, with a weight that settled deep and heavy, that whatever had changed in this house tonight, whatever had reached Lucas in a way nothing else had, it hadn't come from power, or money, or authority, it had come from her, and the silence in the room wasn't empty at all, it was full of something he had never learned how to give. 6 hours earlier, the house had not been quiet, it had been holding its breath, every hallway stretched long and cold under recessed lights that cast pale reflections across polished marble floors, the kind of stillness that did not mean peace but tension waiting to snap, and Naomi Carter moved through it almost unnoticed, her cartwheels barely making a sound as they rolled over the thick runner rugs, her uniform simple, sleeves slightly worn at the edges. Her presence the kind people learned to overlook without thinking, yet her eyes did not miss anything, not the faint scratch marks along the hallway wall at child height, not the way one door at the far end remained closed but never fully, always left open just enough for a sliver of dim light to escape, flickering sometimes as if the room itself could not settle, and when the sound came it was sudden, sharp, not loud enough to echo through the entire house but strong enough to stop her in place. A strained cry that carried something deeper than frustration, something uneven and urgent, and Naomi's hand tightened slightly around the handle of her cart as she listened, her body still, her breath slowing instead of quickening, because she recognized that sound, not from training manuals or instructions written in neat bullet points, but from years ago in a much smaller home where walls were thinner and nights felt longer, where she had learned that not all cries were meant to be silenced quickly, some needed space, patience, presence, and she turned her head toward the hallway, toward that door, hesitation flickering across her face, not from fear but from understanding boundaries she was not supposed to cross, rules spoken clearly during orientation, stay in assigned areas, do not interfere, do not engage, and yet the sound came again, breaking through those rules with something heavier, something that felt personal even when it was not, and she took a slow step forward, then another, the wheels of her cart left behind as she moved quietly down the corridor, her footsteps soft against the floor, the air cooler here, carrying the faint scent of antiseptic and something else, something like exhaustion that had settled into the walls over time, and when she reached the door she did not push it open right away, she paused, fingers hovering near the frame, listening again, letting the rhythm of the room reveal itself, uneven breathing, movement against fabric, the subtle shift of something being knocked lightly out of place, and she exhaled slowly, grounding herself before stepping just inside, not fully entering, not claiming space that was not hers, only enough to see, and there he was, Lucas Whitmore, small for his age, curled near the edge of the bed, hands tight against his ears as if trying to block out something no one else could hear, his movements repetitive but not random, his world contained in patterns that made sense only to him, and Naomi did not speak, did not rush forward, she simply lowered herself quietly to the floor a few feet away, leaving distance between them, her posture open, her hands visible, her presence steady, and in that moment, before anything else could happen, before anyone could interrupt, the room shifted just slightly, not quieter yet, not calm, but different, as if something had entered that did not demand control, only understanding. The door moved before Naomi heard him, a sharp shift in the air behind her followed by the firm, controlled cadence of footsteps that did not rush but did not hesitate either, and Edward Whitmore filled the doorway with a presence that carried authority without needing to announce itself, his posture straight, his expression carved into something unreadable yet unmistakably firm as his gaze locked onto the scene in front of him, the unfamiliar sight of a house employee seated on the floor of his son's room, close enough to be involved yet distant enough to suggest restraint, and for a brief second he said nothing, as if trying to process the interruption to the rigid structure he had spent months enforcing. But the silence did not last. "What are you doing in here?" His voice low, controlled, not raised yet heavy enough to press into the space. And Naomi turned her head slowly, not startled, not defensive, her movements deliberate as she shifted just enough to acknowledge him without breaking the quiet rhythm she had begun to match with Lucas's breathing. He sounded like he needed someone. She answered simply, her tone calm, unembellished, as if stating something obvious rather than challenging authority, and Edward's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at that, the assumption embedded in her words striking something deeper than the situation itself. Because needing someone was not a variable he allowed into equations he could not solve. "You were not instructed to be here," he replied, stepping further into the room, the polished leather of his shoes barely making a sound against the floor yet somehow amplifying his presence. "There are professionals handling his care," and Naomi glanced briefly toward Lucas, who had not stopped moving but whose motions had softened slightly, the sharp edges rounding into something less frantic. "They are not here right now," she said, still without raising her voice, still not moving closer, maintaining that careful distance that respected both the child and the space, and for a moment Edward did not respond, his eyes shifting between her and his son, measuring, calculating, but also missing something he could not quantify, because what he saw did not fit into any of the reports or consultations or structured interventions he had invested in. It looked too simple, too unstructured, too human, and that was precisely why it unsettled him. "Step away," he said finally, not harshly but with finality, a command shaped by habit rather than anger, and Naomi hesitated for the briefest moment, not in defiance but in quiet assessment, her eyes returning to Lucas, noticing the subtle change in his breathing, the way his hands had loosened just slightly from their tight hold, and then she rose slowly, careful, controlled, making no sudden movements as she stepped back toward the door, creating space without breaking the fragile thread that had begun to form, and the instant she moved, the shift was immediate. Lucas's breathing sharpened again, his body tensing, the fragile calm unraveling into the familiar pattern Edward knew too well. And Edward's expression hardened, not in anger but in frustration directed inward and outward at once, because control had been restored yet the room felt more unstable than before, and Naomi paused at the threshold, her hand resting lightly against the door frame, her voice soft but steady as she spoke one last time. "Sometimes they are not asking to be fixed," she said, her words quiet enough to blend into the room yet clear enough to linger. "Sometimes they just do not want to be alone," and then she stepped into the hallway, leaving behind a silence that was no longer empty but unsettled, as if something had been interrupted before it could fully take shape. The door clicked softly behind Naomi as she stepped back into the hallway, and for a moment the house seemed to return to its usual order, polished, controlled, untouched, but inside the room the shift was immediate. The fragile calm that had begun to settle around Lucas unraveled almost as quickly as it had formed, his breathing turning uneven again, his small hands pressing tightly against his ears as if the quiet had been taken away from him, and Edward stood there, just a few feet away, watching it happen in real time, watching the difference between before and after, between presence and absence, yet refusing to move, his posture rigid as if stillness itself could restore control. "Lucas," he said, his voice measured, careful, the way he had been instructed by specialists, calm tone, no sudden movements, no emotional spikes, but the response was not what he wanted. The tension in the room only sharpened, the rhythm he had memorized returning, and Edward exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, not in panic but in contained frustration, the kind that had built over months of trying everything that was supposed to work, everything that had been recommended, everything that had been proven effective in environments that did not look like this one. And he stepped closer, lowering himself slightly as if proximity alone could bridge the distance between them, but Lucas turned away, retreating further into himself, and the room felt smaller somehow, heavier, as if the air itself resisted effort. And Edward stopped, his hand hovering mid-air before lowering again, because he knew this moment, he had lived it night after night, the same pattern, the same outcome, and yet something about tonight was different, not because of what was happening now, but because of what had happened just minutes earlier, something he had interrupted without fully understanding, and his gaze shifted toward the door, toward the empty space where Naomi had been, her words lingering in the silence that followed. Not loud, not forceful, but persistent. Sometimes they just do not want to be alone, and Edward closed his eyes briefly, not to escape but to think, to replay the moment from a different angle, to question something he had never allowed himself to question before, because control had always been his solution, structure his answer, distance his protection, but none of it had brought his son to this kind of quiet, not even for a moment. And now that moment was gone, replaced again by the familiar tension, and the realization settled slowly, not dramatic, not immediate, but steady and unavoidable, that whatever had happened when she was in this room, it had not been random, it had not been coincidence, it had been something he did not understand, and that lack of understanding unsettled him more than the noise ever had, and he turned toward the door again, his hand reaching for the handle before stopping just short, hesitation flickering across his expression for the first time that night, because stepping out meant stepping into something he could not control, something outside the systems he trusted, and yet staying meant repeating the same outcome he already knew, and behind him. The sound continued, not louder, not quieter, just constant, a reminder that what he had been doing was not enough, and in the quiet tension of that hallway, Edward Whitmore stood between two choices, one familiar and failing, the other uncertain and human, and for the first time, the second option did not feel like weakness, it felt like the only thing left. Edward's fingers finally closed around the door handle, the cool metal grounding him for a brief second before he turned it and stepped out into the hallway, the sound behind him not stopping, not softening, just continuing as it always had, steady and unresolved, and the door remained slightly open as if even the room refused to be fully shut off again, and he stood there for a moment, the long corridor stretching out in front of him under soft recessed lights, too quiet compared to the tension he had just left behind, and at the far end he saw her, Naomi Carter, already back near her cart, her hands moving with quiet precision as she folded a cleaning cloth, her posture calm, unchanged, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if she had not just stepped into a space no one else had been able to reach, and Edward walked toward her, his pace measured but purposeful, each step echoing faintly against the polished floor, and she noticed him before he spoke, her hands pausing briefly before settling again, not nervous, not defensive, simply aware, and when he stopped a few feet away there was a silence that held more weight than any immediate question, because this was not a conversation he was used to having, not one where he did not already control the outcome, and for a second he said nothing, his gaze steady, searching for something he could define, but finding only something he could not, and finally his voice came, lower than before, less rigid. "What were you doing in there?" Not an accusation this time, not entirely, but not yet an admission either, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady. "I was sitting with him," she replied, simple, unadorned, and Edward's brow tightened slightly. "That is not a method," he said, the words automatic, shaped by months of structured explanations, clinical language, defined approaches, and Naomi shook her head just once, gently. "It is not meant to be," she said, her voice soft but certain. "It is just being there," and something in the way she said it made the hallway feel different, quieter in a way that was not empty, and Edward glanced back toward the door, the sound from inside still present, still unresolved, and he exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders shifting, not disappearing but changing shape. "It did not stop," he said, more to himself than to her, as if stating a fact he needed to hear out loud, and Naomi followed his glance, her expression thoughtful, not judgmental. "Not yet," she answered, but it almost did, and that word lingered, almost, close enough to matter, far enough to be uncertain, and Edward's jaw tightened again, not in resistance this time but in something closer to realization, because almost was more than he had seen in a long time, and the memory replayed again in his mind. The brief shift, the subtle change, the way Lucas had begun to settle before it was interrupted, and he looked back at Naomi, really looked this time, not at her uniform or her role, but at her presence, her steadiness, the absence of urgency in her posture, and for a moment the hallway seemed to narrow around that realization, because what she offered was not something he could buy, not something he could schedule or assign. And that unsettled him in a way he could not easily dismiss. "You should not have gone in there," he said finally, but the words lacked the sharpness they had carried before, more habit than conviction, and Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the boundary without arguing it. "I know," she said, and there was no apology in her tone, only honesty, and the silence that followed was different again, not tense, not confrontational, but suspended, as if something unspoken was waiting to be decided. And Edward glanced once more toward the open door, the sound still there, steady, unchanged, and when he looked back at her, something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. "If you go back in," he began, the words slow, unfamiliar, "what would you do?" And it was not a test, not a challenge, but a question, real and unguarded, and Naomi did not answer immediately, her eyes softening slightly as she considered it. "The same thing," she said quietly, "I would not try to change him," and Edward held her gaze, the weight of that answer settling into something deeper than logic, something he had resisted for too long, and behind him the room waited, unchanged, but no longer unquestioned. Edward did not respond right away, not because he disagreed, but because something in him had slowed down, like a machine that had been running too long without pause suddenly forced to recalibrate, and the hallway seemed quieter now, not empty, but suspended, as if even the air was waiting for his decision, and behind him the sound from Lucas's room continued, steady, familiar, but no longer something he could ignore or manage from a distance, and he turned slightly, his gaze drifting back toward the half-open door where a thin line of warm light stretched across the polished floor, cutting through the colder tones of the hallway, and for a moment he just stood there, listening, not analyzing, not planning, just listening, the way he had not allowed himself to in months, and Naomi remained where she was, not stepping forward, not filling the silence, her presence steady but unobtrusive, giving him space to arrive at something on his own. And that space mattered more than anything. She could have said, because this was not about convincing him, it was about letting him see, and Edward exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest loosening just enough for something else to take its place, something unfamiliar but not unwelcome, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, not weakened, but stripped of its usual certainty. "If this does not work," he said, the words measured, careful, "then we go back to what we were doing," and it was not a command, not entirely, but a condition, a way to hold on to something known while stepping into something uncertain, and Naomi nodded once, accepting the boundary without hesitation. "Okay," she said simply, and that was all, no promise, no reassurance, just agreement, and Edward looked at her for a second longer, as if expecting more, but there was nothing else, only that quiet readiness, and he stepped aside from the doorway, not fully, but enough, a subtle shift that carried more meaning than any explicit permission, and Naomi understood it without needing it to be stated, her movements calm as she set the folded cloth back onto her cart, leaving everything exactly as it was, no rush, no urgency, just intention. And then she walked toward the room again, her footsteps soft against the floor. The same measured pace as before, as if nothing had changed and yet everything had, and Edward remained just outside, not following, not interfering, his position now different, not at the center, but at the edge, watching, and when Naomi reached the doorway she paused briefly, not to ask, not to confirm, but to listen, her head tilting slightly as she matched the rhythm inside before stepping in, and the room greeted her the same way it had before, with tension still present but not as sharp. As if it remembered her, as if something in it had not fully closed, and she lowered herself again to the floor, the same distance, the same posture, her hands visible, her breathing steady, and she did not speak right away, did not try to interrupt the pattern, she simply aligned herself with it, quiet, patient, present, and outside the door Edward watched, his gaze fixed, his usual instincts held back by something stronger now, something that told him not to interfere, not this time, and the seconds stretched into something longer, not measured by clocks but by shifts so subtle they could easily be missed, the slight change in Lucas's breathing, the gradual easing of tension in his shoulders, the way his movements began to lose their edge, and Edward leaned slightly closer to the doorway, not stepping in, just enough to see more clearly, his expression no longer guarded in the same way, because what was happening now was not dramatic, not immediate, but it was real, and for the First time he allowed himself to stay in that moment without trying to control it, without trying to define it, just watching as something quiet and steady began to take shape again, something he had nearly dismissed, something he was only now beginning to understand. The change did not happen all at once. It was not the kind of moment that demanded attention or announced itself with clarity. It unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, like the slow shift of light across a room, and Naomi remained exactly where she had been, seated on the floor a few feet from Lucas, her posture relaxed but attentive, her breathing steady and unforced, matching nothing at first and then gradually aligning with the uneven rhythm in front of her, and Lucas's movements continued. But something in them had softened, the sharp edges dulling into something less urgent, less frantic, as if the intensity had found somewhere to settle, and Naomi did not reach for him, did not speak over the moment, she simply stayed, her presence constant, a quiet anchor in a space that had known nothing but disruption, and outside the door Edward watched, his hand resting lightly against the frame, his body still but his attention fully engaged. Not calculating, not searching for flaws, just observing. And it was in that stillness that he began to notice what he had missed before, the subtle cues, the way Lucas's breathing began to lengthen, the way his shoulders dropped slightly between movements, the way his hands, once pressed tightly against his ears, loosened just enough to suggest something was changing, and Edward leaned closer, his brow furrowing not in confusion but in realization, because this was not control, this was not intervention in the way he had understood it. It was something quieter, something that did not demand compliance but allowed space, and that difference settled into him slowly, reshaping something he had held onto for too long, and then it happened, not dramatically, not all at once, but unmistakably. Lucas's movement slowed, then paused, his breathing no longer uneven but steady, his small frame easing into the mattress as if a weight had been lifted without anyone touching him. And Naomi remained still, not reacting, not claiming the moment, just allowing it to be what it was, her eyes soft, her presence unchanged, and Edward felt something shift in his chest, something he could not name but could not ignore, because he had seen every attempt, every method, every carefully structured plan fail to reach this point, and yet here it was, unfolding without force, without instruction, without anything he had believed was necessary, and the realization was not loud, not sudden, it was quiet and heavy, settling into him with a clarity that did not require explanation, that he had been wrong, not in effort, not in intention, but in understanding, and he exhaled slowly, the breath deeper than any he had taken that night, his shoulders lowering slightly as the tension he carried began to loosen, and he did not step into the room, did not interrupt what was happening, he simply stayed where he was, watching, learning in a way he had not allowed himself to before, and inside the room Naomi shifted slightly, just enough to rest her hand gently against the floor, her fingers relaxed, not reaching, just present. And Lucas did not pull away, did not retreat, he remained where he was, his breathing steady, his body calm, and the room, once filled with tension, now held something entirely different, something quiet and whole, and Edward understood then, not through words or instruction, but through what he was witnessing, that what had changed his son's night was not something that could be taught through control, it was something that had to be given, freely, patiently, without expectation, and for the first time. He did not feel the need to fix the moment, he only needed to let it continue. Edward did not realize how long he had been standing there until the quiet itself began to feel unfamiliar, not empty, not tense, but full in a way the house had not been in months, and his hand slowly dropped from the doorframe as he took a single step back, careful, deliberate, as if even the sound of movement might disturb what had finally settled inside the room, and he watched for another moment, just long enough to be certain that what he was seeing was not temporary, not fragile in the way he had expected, but steady, grounded, real. Lucas remained still, his breathing even, his small body relaxed into the mattress in a way Edward had almost forgotten was possible, and Naomi had not moved closer, had not claimed the space, she remained where she had been from the beginning, seated on the floor, her presence quiet, her role undefined by any title he had previously assigned to her, and something about that unsettled him again, not in resistance, but in recognition, because nothing in his world worked this way, nothing important happened without structure, without planning, without measurable steps and predictable outcomes, and yet this moment existed outside of all of that, untouched by the systems he trusted, and it worked, and that truth settled deeper than anything he had been told or shown before, and he stepped back fully into the hallway now, the soft light from the room still spilling across the floor behind him, but he did not close the door, he left it open, not wide, just enough, as if the space itself deserved to breathe, and the hallway greeted him with the same quiet it always had. But it no longer felt cold, not in the same way, and he walked slowly down its length, his pace unhurried, his mind not racing but shifting, reorganizing something fundamental that had gone unquestioned for too long. And when he reached Naomi's cart, he stopped, his gaze resting briefly on the folded cloth she had left behind, the simple tools of a role he had once believed defined her entirely, and now they seemed smaller somehow, incomplete, as if they no longer explained who she was or what she had done, and he stood there for a moment, his hand hovering over the edge of the cart before lowering again, not touching anything, just acknowledging the space she had come from, and then he turned back toward the room, not immediately, not with urgency, but with intention, and when he returned to the doorway he did not step inside, he remained where he was, respecting the boundary he had once enforced for all the wrong reasons and was now honoring for the right ones. And Naomi glanced up briefly, not startled, not seeking approval, just aware of his presence, and their eyes met for a second, nothing spoken, nothing needed, and in that brief exchange something passed between them, not authority, not submission, but understanding. And Edward gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, not a command, not even quite a request, but something closer to acknowledgement, to respect, and Naomi returned her gaze to Lucas without reacting to it, because she had not done this for recognition, she had done it because it was needed, and Edward exhaled slowly, the weight he had carried not gone, but changed, no longer something he had to hold alone. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to step away from the need to control what came next, trusting something he could not measure, something he had once dismissed, and as he turned from the doorway again, leaving the light behind him, he understood that whatever this was, whatever had just begun in that room, it was not something he could command, it was something he had to learn to allow. The house did not return to silence all at once, it settled into it slowly, like something learning how to breathe again after holding too much for too long, and the hallway lights dimmed slightly as the night deepened, casting softer reflections across the marble floors that no longer felt as cold as they had earlier, and Edward remained awake, not in his office, not behind a desk filled with numbers and decisions, but in the space just outside his son's room, seated in a chair he had not used in months, his posture no longer rigid, his hands resting loosely instead of clenched, and the door remained slightly open, the same narrow line of warm light stretching into the hallway, steady and quiet, and inside the room nothing dramatic happened, no sudden movement, no breakthrough that demanded recognition, only the gentle rhythm of a child finally at rest and the quiet presence of someone who had chosen to stay. And Naomi had not left her place on the floor, not because she was required to, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she understood that leaving too soon could break something that had only just begun to hold, and her back rested lightly against the side of the bed now, her head tilted slightly as she listened to the steady breathing above her own breathing matching it without effort, and time moved differently in that room, not measured in minutes or hours but in the absence of disruption, in the quiet consistency of peace that did not need to announce itself to be real, and Edward watched from where he sat, not intruding, not analyzing, simply present in a way he had not been before, and every so often his gaze would shift from the doorway to the floor, to his hands, to the stillness around him, as if taking in the weight of what had changed without needing to define it, and the realization did not come in a single thought, it unfolded slowly, layer by layer, that control had never been what his son needed, that distance had never been protection, that everything he had built to manage the situation had only kept him outside of it, and now, in the quiet of this night, he was finally seeing something he had missed, something simple and difficult at the same time, that presence mattered more than perfection, that understanding could exist without explanation, and that someone he had once dismissed without a second thought had given his son something no amount of power or money had been able to provide, and the weight of that did not crush him, it steadied him, grounding him in a way that felt unfamiliar but right. And after a long while Naomi shifted slightly, not to leave, but to ease the tension in her posture, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the mattress as she looked up at Lucas for a brief second, confirming what she already knew, that he was still there, still calm, still safe. In a way that did not require her to do anything more, and she did not wake him, did not speak, she simply remained, and Edward saw that too, the restraint, the patience, the absence of ownership over the moment, and something in his expression softened, not dramatically, but enough to mark a change that would not reverse when morning came, and eventually he stood, not because the moment was over, but because it no longer needed him to stay in the same way, and he walked quietly to the doorway, pausing there just long enough to take in the scene one more time, his son asleep, the room calm, Naomi present but unobtrusive, and he gave a small nod, not to her, not even consciously, but to the moment itself, acknowledging it, accepting it, and then he stepped back, leaving the door open, leaving the light, leaving the quiet exactly as it was, because for the first time, he understood that